Imagine stepping into a room where the air is still heavy with the warmth of breath from people who, by all laws of nature, should be standing right in front of you. On the table, the bowls are filled with half-eaten oatmeal. The steam perhaps only recently vanished into the rafters. A woman's sewing machine sits on a side table, a needle poised mid-stitch over a piece of fabric, waiting for a hand that will never return. This is the Mary Celeste. She wasn't a wreck found splintered on the rocks. She was a snapshot of a life interrupted. When the boarding party climbed over her rails on that biting December morning, they didn't find a struggle. They found a haunting, domestic peace that felt more terrifying than any bloodstain. But to understand why they left, we have to listen to the echoes they left behind. Before we descend into the hull, help us keep these maritime investigations afloat by hitting the like button. We are aiming for 20,000 likes today to unlock the next archive. And subscribe to join our search for the truth. Because on this ship, the most frightening thing wasn't what was missing, but what was left behind. The Atlantic Ocean in December is a landscape of gray on gray, a shifting desert of salt and ice where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams. On December 5, 1872, Captain David Morehouse stood on the deck of the Dei Gratia, his eyes squinting against the stinging spray. He stared through his glass at a speck on the horizon, a brigantine that seemed to be stumbling through the swells like a drunkard in a dark alley. The sails were torn, flapping like the wings of a wounded bird, and she was yawing erratically, her bow pointing toward one horizon and then another, as if she had lost her mind. Morehouse lowered the glass, his brow furrowed, and he muttered to his mate, "There is something very wrong with that ship. She's sailing wild." Therefore, he ordered his men to pull alongside, but as the Dei Gratia drew closer, the silence coming from the other vessel became a physical weight. There were no voices, no rhythmic thud of boots on the deck, no captain shouting orders, just the groan of the masts and the slapping of the sea against the hull. Morehouse's first mate, Oliver DeVoe, climbed over the side and dropped onto the deck of the Mary Celeste. He didn't find a battleground. He didn't find the splintered wood of a pirate raid. Instead, he found an eerie, chilling order. He walked toward the captain's cabin, his own footsteps sounding like thunder in the vacuum of the ship. He pushed the door open, expecting a scent of rot or the sight of a struggle, but instead, he found the captain's logbook sitting perfectly dry on the desk. The ink was long dry, the last entry dated 10 days prior. He looked at the bed. It was made, though the impression of a body still seemed to linger in the blankets. He looked at the floor and saw a child's toys scattered near a corner, as if a game had been interrupted by nothing more than a call to dinner. But when he called out, "Is anyone here?" the only reply was the creak of the floorboards. DeVoe felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the Atlantic winter. He realized that the ship was a ghost, not because of what was there, but because of the terrifying normalcy of the things left behind. The galley was cold, but the pots were still in their places. The men's pipes lay on the tables, half filled with tobacco. Everything suggested that the crew had intended to return in 5 minutes, but 5 minutes had turned into 10 days, and the ocean had swallowed their voices. He turned back to his men, his face pale, and whispered, "She's a coffin, but there are no bodies." To understand the void left behind on the Mary Celeste, we have to step into the mind of Captain Benjamin Briggs. This wasn't a man prone to flights of fancy or maritime superstition. He was a devout, teetotaling New Englander, a man who carried his Bible as often as his sextant. As he stood in the cramped quarters of his cabin weeks before the disappearance, he likely felt a sense of quiet pride. Beside him were his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. To Briggs, this ship wasn't just a commercial vessel carrying 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. It was a floating home. He had brought his family's harmonium on board so Sarah could play hymns to drown out the crashing of the waves. He had packed Sophia's dresses and her tiny dolls. But as the days bled into late November, the atmosphere in that cabin began to shift. We can imagine Briggs leaning over his logbook, the flickering oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows against the wood-paneled walls. The entries start with the rhythmic precision of a professional. Weather patterns, coordinates, the steady progress toward Genoa. But then the tone changes. On November 24th, he records a heavy gale. The ship is being hammered by the North Atlantic, tossed like a toy in a giant's bathtub. He writes about the wind, but he doesn't write about the fear that must have been tightening in his chest as he looked at his wife clutching their daughter while the hull groaned under the pressure of the sea. Therefore, the silence of the final entry on November 25th is deafening. There is no mention of disaster, no frantic, "God save us!" Just a cold, clinical recording of the ship's position near the island of Santa Maria in the Azores. 8 o'clock, the log reads, and then nothing. Why did the ink stop flowing? Briggs was a man of habit. For him to stop recording his life was for him to stop living it. Imagine the internal monologue of a man responsible for his family's lives, hearing a sound from the hold, a low, sinister hiss of escaping gas, or feeling the ship shudder in a way he couldn't explain. He would have looked at Sarah and thought, "I have to get them off this ship, now, before it's too late." He didn't have time to pack. He didn't have time to finish the entry. He grabbed the chronometer and the sextant, but he left the logbook, the very soul of his career, sitting on the desk. He must have believed he was coming back. He probably told Sarah, "It's just a precaution, dear. We'll be back on deck by morning." But as he stepped off the sturdy wood of the Mary Celeste and into the fragile, rocking shell of a small lifeboat, he was stepping into an ending he never saw coming. The logbook stayed behind, a silent witness to a captain who vanished while his ink was still wet. When the Mary Celeste was finally towed into the shadow of the Rock of Gibraltar, she wasn't greeted as a miracle of the sea. She was treated like a crime scene. The air in the Vice Admiralty Court was thick with the smell of old parchment and the salt-crusted clothes of sailors. But the man presiding over the inquiry, Frederick Solly Flood, brought a scent of sharpened steel and cold suspicion. Solly Flood was a man who didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in the darkness of the human heart. He looked at the Dei Gratia crew, the very men who had saved the ship, and saw not heroes, but scavengers. He paced the stone floor of the courtroom, his voice echoing with a sharp, accusatory edge as he declared, "A ship does not simply empty itself of its soul. Men do not walk off a perfectly sound vessel unless they are driven off by force or drawn away by greed." Therefore, he turned his gaze toward the hull of the Mary Celeste, looking for blood. He found what he was looking for on a heavy, ornamental sword tucked beneath the captain's berth. He pulled it out, the metal scraping against the wood with a high-pitched whine, and pointed to a dark, reddish-brown crust clinging to the blade. "Behold," he hissed to the court, "the signature of a mutiny. This is not the work of the sea. This is the work of a blade." But the suspicion didn't stop at the sword. Solly Flood climbed onto the deck and knelt by the railings, running his fingers over deep gashes in the wood. He imagined a struggle, men screaming, the sound of heavy boots sliding across wet timber, the splash of bodies being heaved into the dark Atlantic. He convinced himself that the crew of the Dei Gratia had stumbled upon the Mary Celeste, murdered everyone on board for the salvage money, and then staged the ghost ship scene to fool the world. He looked at Captain Morehouse and saw a murderer hiding behind a mask of maritime brotherhood. The air in the courtroom grew suffocating as Solly Flood presented his theory of a drunken, bloody uprising. He spoke of the ship's cargo, the industrial alcohol, and suggested the crew had broken into the barrels, lost their minds in a haze of grain spirit, and slaughtered the Briggs family. However, his evidence began to crumble under the light of actual science. The dark stains on the sword? They weren't blood. When tested, they were revealed to be nothing more than common rust, the inevitable result of salt air meeting old iron. The gashes on the rail? They weren't from a hatchet. They were natural splinters from the ship's movement against the waves. Solly Flood's face reddened as his truth evaporated. But the damage was done. The world now looked at the Mary Celeste not with pity, but with a lingering, dark doubt. The inquiry ended not with a resolution, but with a bitter compromise. The salvage crew was paid, but only a fraction of what they deserved, leaving them with the stain of a crime they never committed. The ship was released, but she carried a new reputation, a vessel that drove men to madness and stained their names with the phantom blood of a family that had simply vanished. Deep in the belly of the ship lay 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, a volatile, invisible passenger that didn't care for the lives of those above. When the boarding party inspected the cargo, they found that 9 of those barrels were empty. They weren't broken, and they hadn't leaked onto the floorboards. They were simply hollow. This brings us to the most chilling scientific possibility, the flash vapor theory. Imagine the heat of the hold building as the ship moved through shifting temperatures. A small leak in just a few of those white oak barrels would have released a colorless, odorless gas. It would have pooled in the darkness, growing denser and more explosive with every passing hour. Captain Briggs, a man who famously forbade a single drop of liquor for consumption on his ship, would have known the danger of his cargo better than anyone. Therefore, imagine the moment the cabin floor began to vibrate. Perhaps there was a low, muffled thump. Not an explosion that shattered wood, but a rumble of pressure. As Briggs opened the hatch to investigate, a cloud of invisible, shimmering vapor would have rushed past him, smelling of sweet, chemical fire. In that moment, he wouldn't have seen a leak. He would have seen a bomb. He would have felt the air itself become a threat, a silent killer that could ignite with a single spark from a cook stove or a stray lantern. He would have turned to his crew, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp desperation. "Out! Everyone out! She's going to blow!" There was no time to think. There was only time to react. He believed the Mary Celeste was seconds away from becoming a fireball on the Atlantic. In his mind, the sturdy ship was no longer a refuge. It was a cage. He ordered the main peak halyard, the sturdy rope used to haul the sails, to be cut and tied to the lifeboat. Therefore, the controlled panic begins to make sense. They didn't flee a ghost. They fled a perceived explosion. They lowered the small boat into the churning water, huddled together. Sarah, little Sophia, the crew, clinging to that single rope, trailing behind the ship like a child holding a balloon. They intended to wait for the air to clear, to let the poison vent out of the hold so they could climb back aboard. But they were tethered to a giant by a single, fraying cord. And in the North Atlantic, the wind is a cruel master that does not wait for a captain to change his mind. But there is another truth lurking beneath the keel. One that doesn't smell of alcohol or blood, but of the very earth shuddering beneath the sea. The Mary Celeste was passing through the Azores, a volcanic archipelago where the floor of the ocean is a restless, jagged jigsaw of tectonic plates. Imagine the crew in a moment of deceptive calm. The sails are full, and the rhythm of the ship is a steady, comforting rock. But then, without warning, the world vibrates. This isn't the swaying of a wave, it's a violent, vertical jolt that rattles the teeth in the sailors' skulls. A seaquake. In this moment, the ship becomes a percussion instrument. The heavy masts groan in their sockets, and the cargo in the hold shifts with a sound like grinding bone. But the real terror happens in the dark corners where the water sits. The shock wave from an underwater tremor can create a massive surge of pressure, forcing bilge water up into the pumps. Captain Briggs would have rushed to the deck, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the sounding rod come up dripping. Therefore, he would have looked at the measurements and seen a terrifying lie. The rod showed the ship was taking on water at an impossible rate. He didn't know that the water hadn't leaked in from the hull. It had been forced up from the bottom by the earthquake. To Briggs, standing on a deck that was still vibrating from the planet's hidden fury, the conclusion was inescapable. His ship was foundering. She was heavy, sluggish, and sinking into the abyss. He would have looked at Sarah, her face pale as she clutched Sophia, and the internal monologue of a protector would have overridden the logic of a captain. "The pumps are failed," he might have shouted over the roar of the wind. "She's going down! To the boat! To the boat!" Therefore, the abandonment wasn't a choice. It was a desperate flight from a phantom sinking. They scrambled into the small yawl, the wood of the lifeboat feeling impossibly thin against the massive, roiling Atlantic. They were looking at the Mary Celeste, waiting for her bow to dip, waiting for the bubbles to rise as she disappeared. But the ship didn't sink. She sat high in the water, mocking them with her buoyancy. They were trapped in a tiny wooden bowl, watching their only home drift away on a current they couldn't catch. The sinking ship proving to be the only thing in the world that was actually safe. They had fled a lie, and the price of that mistake was the open, empty horizon. We are left with the final, haunting image of a controlled, abandonment. This wasn't a tragedy of fire or a massacre of blades. It was a tragedy of timing. Imagine the 10 souls huddled in that small lifeboat, the wood beneath them slick with salt. They are tied to the Mary Celeste by a single rope, the main peak halyard. For a few minutes, or perhaps a few hours, there is hope. They watch the ship, waiting for the explosion that never comes, or the sinking that was only an illusion. They are close enough to hear the sails snap in the wind, close enough to see the captain's cabin window reflecting the pale winter sun. But then, the Atlantic provides the final, cruel therefore. A sudden squall, a change in the current, or a sharp gust catches the sails of the Mary Celeste. The ship, lightened by the absence of her crew and the loss of those 9 empty barrels, lurches forward. The rope, the only thing connecting the living to their salvation, strains. It snaps with the sound of a pistol shot. In that heartbeat, the distance between life and death begins to grow. The crew rows with a desperate, lung-burning intensity, their oars splashing uselessly against the massive swells. They scream, but their voices are swallowed by the roar of the spray. They watch as the Mary Celeste, ghost-white and beautiful, sails away from them at 5 knots, then 6, then 7. She is a perfect machine of wood and canvas, doing exactly what she was built to do, cross the ocean. But she is doing it without them. The internal monologue of Captain Briggs in those final moments must have been a devastating realization of his own humanity. He had tried to protect his family. He had made the right decision based on the evidence of his eyes and ears. But the sea doesn't care about intentions. He would have held Sarah and Sophia as the Mary Celeste became a tiny white speck on the horizon, and then, eventually, nothing at all. They were left in a world that had become 404, file not found. A family, a crew, and a future, all deleted by a single snapped rope. When we look at the Mary Celeste, we aren't just looking at a mystery. We are looking at the fragility of our own controlled lives. We build our ships, we keep our logs, and we play our hymns to drown out the noise of the dark. But there is a profound, aching connection in knowing that, like Briggs, we are all just one snap of a rope away from the infinite silence. The ship sailed on, foundering only when she was finally found, while the people who loved her became part of the salt and the foam. They didn't leave because they were haunted. They left because they were human. And the ocean, in its beautiful, terrifying indifference, simply kept moving.